All right, folks. So today, for our next ethical philosopher, we are jumping way in time. All right, we're going from the Greeks now to the British. Right, most specifically, we're going into Thomas Hobbes. And the reason why Thomas Hobbes is such an influential ethicist that we need to discuss is because he was the very first, well, one of the very first philosophers who basically said for any society, for any organization to escape a state of anarchy, to escape a dog-eat-dog type of reality, we're going to have to create something called the social contract. And ever since he created that, back in, I think it was around 1585, between 1575, 1585 is when he wrote this. But ever since then, social contracts have been the foundation, the glue of just about every successful and thriving society from then until now, right? So today we are going to be concerned with what Hobbes called a state of nature, how we create a social contract from a state of nature, and eventually what is the ethical responsibilities that should be had once the social contract has been drawn up and established. All right. So the first thing to start off with is that Hobbes was concerned with two fundamental questions. They were, why do we even need government in the first place? If you ask any libertarian out there, they'll be the first to say, I don't think government should have any role over the American life. We should be able to do whatever the hell we want to because we're free, right? So if that's the case, why need a government, right? And then the second question is, well, what is the role of government in the lives of individual citizens, right? So we need to first address why a government is needed to begin with, and then what role should that government serve once it's been established? Because one of the things that Plato mentioned that we discussed a little bit was something called the noble lie. And the noble lie is essentially any lie that a society has to tell that allows people to kind of revolve around it, to kind of believe in it. And one of the noble lies that America practices, for instance, is the idea of freedom. We always like to bang and promote this idea that, hey, America's great because we have freedom. We have freedom and we have liberty. We can do whatever we want. But is that the case? Not entirely. Freedom is the noble lie, because do you really have ultimate freedom? Do you really have the ability to get mad at a neighbor and shoot them and get away with it? Do you have the freedom to, be the next Pablo Escobar and not have to worry about the consequences? Absolutely not. You have certain freedoms, but you don't have this romantic idea of freedom that we like to propose around the world that makes us think that America's great. So if every state and every society kind of has that noble lie embedded in them, well, we have to understand why that's relative to Hobbes and his state of nature. So to understand how a social contract is formed, before we can understand how a social contract can be built around either a noble lie or just a good authoritative figure, we have to figure out what a state of nature is first. In a nutshell, the state of nature, the state of nature is a ruthless, dog-eat-dog, perpetual state of warfare, where anything goes and any act of violence is justifiable insofar as it contributes to your self-preservation. Okay? This sort of world is what's called the default state of man. So before humans invented laws, before we invented rituals, before we invented religion, before we even knew of things like a society, we lived in a state of nature, right? We live in a world that you could basically consider anarchy, right? The opposite of living in a state with the social contract is living in a state of anarchy. So when you think anarchy, think a state of nature, because that's really dog eat dog. That's why one of the movies you'll probably have to watch for this philosopher is the movie called Mad Max, the new one, because it's all about a state of nature and doing this. But anyway, going back to the state of nature. This sort of work, like I said, is the default state of man where no laws and no government exist to maintain order. For example, like when a big hurricane comes or a natural disaster, we're all civil, we're all nice to each other, we're all kind and charitable, but as soon as a natural disaster happens, well, bang, all of a sudden our selfishness comes out. It's just who can get to the front of the line to get the MRE, who can get the goods, the resources first. Our true selfish, ego-driven nature comes out in a state of nature. And so, because there's no laws, because there is no order in a state of nature, what is the good? What in the world of ethics could ever be considered good in a state of nature where there are no laws, there's no rules and regulations? What can be considered good? Well, Hobbes says the only thing that can be considered good in a state of nature is self-preservation. Anything you need to do to survive is the good. Because if you think about it logically, there's no way to create anything else considered good if you ain't alive. If you're dead, game over, end of story. So you had to do whatever was required to survive, to have that self-preservation. Because one of Hobbes's famous quotes is that in a state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And the only way to escape a nasty, brutish, and short life is to get out of that state of nature and start creating a social contract. So not only would humans be at war with nature and starvation of the elements, but in a state of nature, you're also fighting a war with every single human being, because, I don't know, if you live in one cave, someone else lives in another cave, yet there's only one deer that you need to eat to survive, well, you'll be at war with them if you live in a state of nature to whoever gets that resource. So the only way to escape that is to create something called the social contract. You really don't need to know that. But what he's saying is that if you were living in a state of nature, and let's say someone's trying to cause you harm, right? They want to cause you harm or they want to steal from you. A person could feel irritated. They could feel angry and say that the harms done to you were unfair. Like, it's unfair that they stole my stuff. This is wrong. This is unethical. No. Not so, according to Hobbes. If you're in a state of nature, the person who stole from you, the person who's trying to cause you harm, they're playing fair. Why? Because there are no rules. There's no sense of justice in a state of nature. So whether something is good or bad, right or wrong, it only exists when there is a goal to achieve. And in a state of nature, the only goal to achieve is survivability. All right. So now that you kind of know what a state of nature is, how do we escape it? How do we get out of it? Well, it all kind of comes down to this. If everyone is in a consistent state of war, right? If I have, this queen here, and just like in England, let's say they were fighting the Wars of the Roses, or I don't know, Game of Thrones, and you got Daenerys and Cersei. They're always going to be at war with each other. And this is going to take a toll. It's going to take a psychological toll on anyone. Imagine having to wake up every morning going, God, what am I going to have to do today to survive? What am I going to have to do today to defend myself from someone taking my stuff? What am I going to have to do to protect myself at any and all cost? Having to think about that kind of thing is extremely taxing. It's extremely stressful. So that's why there are 5 steps you need to know to creating a social contract. And the first step is realizing that the goal, because remember, really the only thing that can be said to be gathered out of the state of nature is having the goal of survival. But the first step in creating a nature is that the goal can only be said to be good that exists within a state of nature is self-preservation, right? So self-preservation is the goal. Therefore, in every action we take while in a state of nature, we should strive for that self-preservation. Now, this state of nature just properly reflects what it means to be human. And to be human, whether whoever teaches you or not, being human is being selfish. We are just self-interested, survival-oriented machines. Now, you may say, that's not true. Not everyone is selfish. And this brings up a question that Hobbes brings up in his book, The Leviathan. He asks a question like, well, so are all humans at their roots fundamentally selfish? How is a volunteer at a soup kitchen or a missionary to Africa who's building wells for people who don't have it or building schoolhouses for children, how are they actually considered selfish? Well, Hobbes would say people who are charitable like that are only charitable because their selfish drives to assert them as morally superior. In other words, folks, people do what makes them feel good. That's what it boils down to. And whether that's you giving money to charity, you give money to charity because it makes you feel good. I gave $1,000 to this arts program in college, and look at the play they're putting on. They couldn't have done that without my generous contribution, right? Or this church would never have been able to build a new wing if it wasn't for my tithing and our contributions, right? We all do things from charity to stealing to anything in life for one reason and one reason only, because it makes us feel good. And is it a bad thing that being charitable makes us feel good? No, it's not. Charitability, that reciprocation, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, that's kind of the core of a social contract. But to delude yourself into thinking that that ain't selfish is a delusion, right? It's all, and that's what he says, is that because humans are all selfish at their core, you can't really rely on just one person from a state of nature to make the rules. You need a social contract, so a contract created by a society of people, not just the individual. An individual will always create a contract that benefits them and no one else. So, now you really don't need to know that. Let's see. So the second step. All right. So once all the fighting is done, once you've realized, dude, being at constant state of war in a state of nature, this ain't fun. I don't like having to wake up wondering how I'm going to survive. So the second step is in creating a social contract is to ensure our self-preservation while accepting the fact that we're all selfish. We all need to strive towards a higher common goal, a higher sense of self-preservation, which basically requires removing the threat of other humans. Hobbes says, and I quote, "What humans eventually realize is that we have to seek peace." All right. So basically, the second step in creating a social contract is realizing that, yeah, we're selfish. We're not going to get rid of that. And as long as we're selfish, other humans, other people will always be a threat to our interest. So rather than fight with them, what if, rather than fighting with my neighbor who lives in the cave over at the deer, what if I talked to my neighbor and said, hey, that deer is fat enough that we can both kill it and both eat it, establishing that common goal. That's a higher sense of self-preservation, right? And so the third step to gaining that higher goal is you can do it one of two ways. Hobbes says that there's basically two ways you can manufacture this type of higher purpose, this higher self-preservation. And notice how I said manufacture. Power is a fickle thing. There's two types of power: manufactured power and organic power. Manufactured power is very Machiavellian, who will be our next philosopher, but it's very chess-based. It's for you to gain power, you use people like pawns on a chessboard. That's how you gain. That's manufactured power. Organic power is you are who you are, and people are so admired with you and so infatuated with you that they just follow you by themselves, by choice. And that type of power, that type of gravity is more organic. It's just natural. And so the way that relates is because of the two ways to get that higher sense of self-preservation, which are force and fraud. He says that the two ways to gain peace for a social contract is force and fraud. Force is like I said, use your natural gifts to overpower people, to essentially make them your slaves, right? And we're going to see the pros and cons of this right now. Because see, Hobbes says if you use force and fraud, it will work like manufactured power. It only works in the short term, because force works with if you have strength. But you can see in modern day times that strength is no longer the top way to make money. In our modern everyday world, brains are the new sexy, right? Muscles, brawn, good to look at, but it's a time of human past, because that's not where the future is going. So anyone who tries to create power using force, 9 times out of 10, they're going to be outthought, out-clevered by someone else, like a chess player, that will eventually find a way to get rid of the person who got their power using force. So the second way to gain power, and this is the best way, is, like I said, by signing a contract with your neighbor, essentially a social contract, to promote self-preservation by using cooperation and reciprocation. Cooperation and reciprocation, put it bluntly, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. You know, live together or die alone. That's what that third step is. So you can either gain the power and have that social contract using force and fraud. But remember, that's like manufactured power. It will work in the short term, but in the long term, that person's going to get beat by the smarter person every time. Or you can do what the smart person would do, and that's be diplomatic and create a contract with your neighbor that promotes cooperation and reciprocation. But before we can move to the fourth step, we have to remember how selfish we humans can be. So because the depths of our selfishness are infinite, a social contract by itself isn't enough. It isn't. Just like how our laws in America aren't enough. If you're wanting to break the law, if you want to sell drugs on the street, if you want to speed down the interstate, you can if you want to, right? The laws exist, that social contract exists, but it's not always going to be enforceable, right? So Hobbes said, well, if we're going to have a social contract, we got to have someone at the top. We got to have the king, right? And so he called this cat the sovereign, right? So the fourth step in creating a social contract is that every society has to establish a sovereign. You can call this a monarch, you can call it a president, but you gotta have a sovereign. You gotta have a CEO. You gotta have a boss. Because you gotta have someone enforce the social contract. If you don't have anyone enforce the social contract, all it is a piece of paper, but in reality, you still live in a state of nature. It's the problem with a lot of these underdeveloped African countries or Eastern Bloc countries in Europe, is they may have a fancy constitution and laws on paper, but what really rules the land is force and fraud, strength, right? So there's not really a sovereign to keep law and order, unlike in these countries like us and, Western Europe and China and Russia. We all have sovereigns, someone to be the central authority and the central power. Because in a state of nature, he puts, we're all free, right? In every sense of the word. Remember, state of nature is like anarchy. Anarchy is the only way you can have 100% true freedom. And while freedom may seem to be good, well, Hobbes demonstrates that freedom creates the state of nature. So we get to our fifth and final step of a social contract, and that is to avoid anarchy. The society that wants to be a part of the social contract, the society that wants to escape the state of nature, the society that wants to live in, not citizenship, if they want to live in a civilization, in a civilized civilization, then they have to, and like I said, the fifth step is willingly hand over and sacrifice a few of their rights and control over to the sovereign. You have to give certain rights, like certain types of your freedom, to a sovereign so that they have the power to enforce any law that may be broken. For instance, one of the best case examples in modern day is like when you sign a cell phone contract, right? None of us read that 20-page contract, but if you did, within that contract, you are basically giving the government permission to do what's called, they harvest your metadata, which means you are sacrificing your private life, your private communications to the government so that the government can use the NSA and FBI counterterrorism, and they look for flag words, right? If you send a message and you use certain terms that are considered a threat, they are going to take that from your text messages, from your email, pull it out, and now you become a person of interest. They can do that. They can protect us that way because we have sacrificed certain freedoms to our sovereign, the government, so that they can enforce the social contract, which is don't commit terrorism in the homeland, right? So the point being is, since there is no morality in a state of nature, the only way to establish morality is to allow the sovereign to create laws. Laws that allow a society to become prosperous, and those laws create a foundation to a new moral order. And the job as the sovereign is to protect that peace at all costs. Okay? So, folks, I believe that is all. Yep, that is Thomas Hobbes. So the two big things to take away from this is the state of nature, what consists of and how a state of nature functions, but more importantly, how we evolve out of a state of nature to create a social contract, and in turn to create a sovereign to make sure that that social contract doesn't devolve back into a state of nature. Hope that makes sense. If not, shoot me an email and we'll explain it later. Until then, adios.